While many Nigerians are debating who is more influential between Nnamdi Kanu and Sunday Igboho, almost nobody is asking why Omoyele Sowore is drawing such a hard line between them now. Because this moment is not really about personalities. It is about power, loyalty, and the silent struggle over who defines resistance in Nigeria. Across the country, conversations are heating up in bus parks, in living rooms, on radio shows, and across social media. People are comparing two men who, on the surface, appear to represent the same frustration, a deep dissatisfaction with the Nigerian state. But Sowore's refusal to accept that comparison introduces a new layer of tension. And it raises a more uncomfortable question. What exactly does he see that many Nigerians are missing? Is this simply a personal disagreement or a signal of a deeper political divide already taking shape beneath the surface? Before going deeper into this story, if you are new here, welcome to Naija Update 24/7, your daily source for breaking Nigerian news, political analysis, and the stories shaping our country. Subscribe now and stay informed. The immediate trigger for this debate came from Sowore's direct and public rejection of the idea that Kanu and Igboho belong in the same category. His language was not casual, it was deliberate, sharp, and pointed. By suggesting betrayal and ideological inconsistency, he was not just disagreeing, he was drawing a boundary. That boundary matters. For years, both Kanu and Igboho have been seen by many Nigerians as symbols of regional resistance. Their names often come up in the same conversations about marginalization, insecurity, and the demand for self-determination. But Sowore's intervention disrupts that narrative. It forces a pause, and it forces a re-examination. This moment did not emerge in isolation. It is happening at a time when Nigeria is once again entering a politically sensitive phase. Conversations around 2027 are already quietly shaping public discourse. Security challenges remain unresolved in many regions, and questions about fairness, inclusion, and national unity continue to dominate political discussions. In that environment, every statement carries weight. Looking back briefly, the paths of these two figures show both similarities and differences. Kanu built a movement that is structured, ideological, and rooted in a clear demand for secession through the indigenous peoples of Biafra. His influence has extended beyond Nigeria's borders, and his legal battles with the state have become a defining part of his political identity. Igboho, on the other hand, emerged from a different context. His activism is more closely tied to local security concerns in the southwest, particularly around clashes between farmers and herders. His alignment with regional security initiatives like Amotekun placed him in a space that blends activism with local governance realities. Both men speak to real grievances, but they do not operate in the same political framework. So why does that distinction matter now? If both figures rose from a shared frustration with the Nigerian system, why is Sowore insisting that they are fundamentally different? To understand that, the focus shifts from individuals to institutions. At the center of this issue is the structure of the Nigerian state itself. The federal government holds significant authority, particularly over security. Agencies like the Department of State Service and the military operate under federal command, and their actions often reflect broader political priorities. The judiciary also plays a critical role. Court decisions, detention orders, and legal interpretations shape how cases like these unfold. But in Nigeria, the line between legal process and political influence is often blurred, creating room for debate about fairness and consistency. Regional structures add another layer. In the southwest, Amotekun represents an attempt to respond to local security challenges within the framework of the law. It reflects a form of negotiated autonomy, one that operates within the Nigerian system rather than directly challenging it. This is where the contrast becomes sharper. Nigeria's constitution guarantees certain freedoms, including the right to expression and assembly, but those rights exist alongside laws that protect national unity and security. When agitation movements cross into demands for secession, the state responds differently. That difference is not always explained clearly to the public. Instead, it plays out through actions, arrests, negotiations, court rulings, and sometimes silence. And this is where one of the most important insights begins to emerge. The difference in how these two figures are treated is not just about law. It reflects a deeper calculation by the state, a calculation of risk. Every government, whether openly or quietly, assesses threats based on their potential impact. Not all forms of dissent are seen as equal. Some are viewed as manageable, others are seen as existential. In Nigeria's case, movements that directly challenge the idea of a united country are often treated with a higher level of urgency. That urgency shapes the response, the narrative, and the level of engagement. But this approach creates its own tension. When citizens perceive inconsistency, trust begins to erode. Questions arise about fairness, about whether the system treats different regions equally, about whether political considerations outweigh legal principles. And those questions do not stay in the background. They become part of everyday conversation. Sowore's statement enters this already complex environment and pushes it further. By rejecting the comparison, he's not just making a personal judgment. He's highlighting differences that may have been overlooked or deliberately ignored. But his words also carry another implication. They suggest that the struggle for justice and reform in Nigeria is not as unified as it appears. Behind the public narratives, there may be competing visions of what change should look like, different strategies, different end goals, and different relationships with power. This is where the tension deepens, because when movements that claim to represent the people begin to diverge, the impact goes beyond rhetoric. It affects how Nigerians understand their own political reality. It influences who they trust, and it shapes how future alliances are formed. At the same time, the political class is watching, quietly but carefully. Moments like this provide insight into the strength or weakness of opposition voices. A divided front is easier to manage than a unified one, and in a system where power is often negotiated rather than openly contested, that matters. So the debate over whether Kanu and Igboho are comparable is not just an academic exercise. It is part of a larger conversation about identity, strategy, and the future of political resistance in Nigeria. It is also a reminder that not all movements that emerge from the same frustration will follow the same path. As the situation continues to unfold, one thing becomes clear. This is not just about what is being said. It is about what those statements reveal, about the structure of power, about the limits of unity, and about the difficult questions Nigerians must confront as they navigate an increasingly complex political landscape. What begins to emerge at this point is not just a disagreement between voices, but a quiet struggle over influence. Beneath the surface of public debate, political actors are already calculating what this moment means for the future. As Nigeria moves gradually toward another election cycle, loyalty is becoming a valuable currency. Not just loyalty to parties, but loyalty to ideas, identities, and regional narratives. For some politicians, moments like this are opportunities. A divided activist space makes it easier to engage different groups separately, to negotiate influence without facing a unified demand. It allows political actors to speak different languages to different audiences. Reform in one region, security in another, unity in public, and strategy behind closed doors. In that environment, fragmentation is not accidental. It can be useful. Those who benefit most are often not the loudest voices. They are the quiet observers, the elites who understand that a scattered opposition rarely translates into coordinated political pressure. When resistance is divided, it becomes easier to manage, easier to predict, and in some cases easier to absorb into the system it once challenged. But there is also a cost. What risks being lost is the possibility of a shared national movement, one that cuts across ethnic and regional lines. For years, Nigerians have shown moments of collective frustration, moments where the focus shifts from tribe to governance, from identity to accountability. Yet, those moments often fade when deeper divisions resurface. This is where the strategic differences between the movements become critical. One path is structured, ideological, and tightly controlled. It builds around a clear message, a defined objective, and a strong central voice. That kind of movement can mobilize quickly, maintain discipline, and sustain a long-term narrative. But it also becomes highly visible and therefore highly vulnerable to state response. The other path is more fluid. It grows from local realities, security concerns, cultural identity, everyday experiences. It does not always rely on a single central authority. Instead, it spreads through communities, through informal networks, through shared experiences. That flexibility can make it harder to contain, but also harder to unify. These differences are not academic. They shape how each movement interacts with power. In the Southeast, the language of marginalization carries historical weight. It connects present grievances to past conflicts, to unresolved questions about inclusion and representation. That narrative is powerful, but it also places the movement in direct tension with the idea of a single Nigerian state. In the Southwest, the focus has often been more pragmatic. Security, restructuring, and regional autonomy dominate the conversation. The emphasis is less on separation and more on renegotiation, on redefining how the region fits within the federation. These are two different political directions, and when they are placed side by side, the question is no longer whether they are similar. The question becomes whether they can ever align. Behind this visible layer, another group operates quietly. Political figures who do not openly associate with agitation movements, but remain deeply aware of their influence. They listen, they measure public sentiment, and in some cases, they position themselves to benefit from it. The security establishment plays a role that is rarely discussed openly. Its actions shape outcomes, but its motivations are often interpreted rather than explained. Decisions about enforcement, engagement, or restraint are influenced by a mix of legal, political, and strategic considerations. This creates a system where outcomes are not always predictable, but they are rarely accidental. And this is where the tension in Sowore's statement becomes more significant. It begins to look less like a personal opinion and more like a warning or perhaps an exposure. Because if these movements are not aligned, then the idea of a unified resistance begins to weaken. And if that unity weakens, the balance of power shifts. The deeper question then comes into focus. Is this moment revealing a hidden alignment that Nigerians have not fully seen, or is it exposing a fracture that has been there all along? At this stage, the debate is no longer just about individuals. It becomes a contest over narrative. Who defines what resistance means in Nigeria? Who decides which struggles are legitimate and which are not? And more importantly, who benefits from that definition? Because control of narrative is not just about words. It shapes public perception, it influences international attention, and it determines how history will remember these moments. As this realization settles in, the impact begins to spread beyond the individuals at the center of the debate. Across the country, the effects are already taking shape. In terms of national stability, the risk is subtle but real. When different regions begin to tell different stories about injustice, those narratives can compete rather than complement each other. Instead of building a broader understanding, they can deepen divisions. This does not always lead to open conflict, but it creates a constant tension, an underlying sense that the country is moving in different directions at the same time. For governance, the implications are equally significant. A fragmented civic space makes it harder to sustain pressure for reform. Governments respond more strongly when demands are clear, unified, and consistent. When voices are divided, responses can be selective, engagement can be limited, and accountability can be diluted. Over time, activism itself risks becoming politicized, not just as a tool for change, but as a space where influence is contested, negotiated, and sometimes co-opted. The economic dimension is often less visible, but no less important. Investors watch stability, they watch narratives, they pay attention to how a country manages internal dissent. When signals become mixed, when tensions rise without clear resolution, it creates uncertainty, and uncertainty affects decisions. At the same time, regional tensions can shape economic activity within the country. Movement of goods, local investments, and even employment patterns can be influenced by perceptions of stability or risk. Security agencies respond to these shifts in their own way. Fragmented agitation does not necessarily reduce concern. In some cases, it increases it. Multiple movements operating with different goals and structures can create a more complex security landscape. The response is often increased surveillance, closer monitoring, and at times, stronger enforcement actions. And then there is public trust, perhaps the most fragile element in all of this. When people begin to question whether the system is fair, whether activists are consistent, or whether narratives are being shaped for political purposes, trust begins to erode, slowly at first, then more visibly. And once that trust weakens, it becomes difficult to rebuild. There is a quiet irony in all of this.
Movements that begin with the goal of challenging power can, through division, end up reinforcing it. Not intentionally, but as a consequence of fragmentation. Because a divided challenge is easier to withstand than a unified one. Beyond Nigeria's borders, the situation is also being observed. International partners tend to approach internal agitation movements with caution. There is a balance they try to maintain: support for human rights on one hand and respect for national sovereignty on the other. This often leads to measured responses, statements that acknowledge concerns without taking strong positions. Human rights organizations, however, tend to focus more directly on individual cases. Detentions, legal processes, and allegations of rights violations attract attention, reports, and advocacy. These external perspectives shape Nigeria's image: a country managing internal dissent under pressure, a democracy navigating the limits of freedom and control, a system trying to balance unity with diversity. Among Nigerians in the diaspora, reactions are more emotional, more immediate. In parts of the United Kingdom, the United States, and across Europe, support networks have formed around different causes. For some, the struggle represented by Kanu carries deep personal and historical meaning. For others, the approach associated with Igboho reflects a more grounded response to immediate realities. But even within these communities, unity is not guaranteed. Debates mirror those happening at home: differences in perspective, in strategy, in belief. And as these narratives travel across borders, they gain new dimensions, shaped by distance, by experience, and by the freedom to speak without immediate consequence. Which brings the story back to a central tension: are Nigerians responding to facts on the ground, or to narratives shaped by politics, identity, and emotion? Because in moments like this, the line between reality and perception becomes difficult to separate. And in that space, the real battle is not just over territory or ideology. It is over understanding, over what people believe is happening, and over what they choose to do about it. As the debate continues to spread, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Many Nigerians are responding to this moment through familiar assumptions that feel logical on the surface but begin to break down under closer examination. One of the most common beliefs is simple: that both figures are fighting the same fight, that they represent different faces of a single struggle against injustice, marginalization, and insecurity. It is an idea that brings comfort because it suggests unity. It suggests that across regions there is a shared direction. But the reality is more complicated. What appears similar from a distance often reveals sharp differences up close. The ideological foundations behind each movement are not identical. One is rooted in a clearly defined political objective, built over time into a structured campaign with a global voice. The other draws strength from immediate lived experiences, local conflicts, cultural identity, and the urgency of community protection. These are not just different methods, they are different visions. And those differences influence everything: how support is built, how messages are communicated, and how each movement interacts with the Nigerian state. Another assumption follows closely behind: that their struggles are interchangeable, that what applies to one must naturally apply to the other. But history does not support that view. Each movement has evolved within its own context, shaped by unique regional pressures and historical memory. In one region, the weight of past conflicts continues to define present fears. In another, the focus is on present-day security challenges and the need for immediate solutions. These experiences are not easily merged into a single narrative. Yet public discourse often tries to do exactly that. It simplifies, it compresses, it turns complex realities into familiar stories that are easier to understand, easier to share, and easier to defend. This is where competing interpretations begin to take hold. On one side is a perspective that questions consistency. It asks whether all forms of resistance can be placed under the same moral or political framework. It challenges the idea that similar language automatically means similar intent. On the other side is a broader public view, one that sees both figures as symbols, symbols of defiance, symbols of frustration, symbols of a system that many feel has not delivered on its promises. Both perspectives carry weight, but neither fully captures the complexity of the situation. Because the truth does not sit comfortably in either position, it exists in the space between them, in the tension between perception and reality. And the evidence, when carefully considered, points in one direction. The comparison itself oversimplifies what is actually happening. It reduces layered political movements into a single storyline. It ignores the strategic differences, the historical context, and the distinct relationships each has with power. And in doing so, it risks misleading the very people trying to make sense of it. This realization shifts the conversation. It moves it away from personalities and towards structure, away from emotion and towards analysis. And once that shift happens, attention naturally turns to the future. Because the real question is no longer about what has been said, it is about what happens next. In the coming months, one of the clearest developments to watch will be how narratives evolve. Voices like Sowore are unlikely to remain silent. If anything, moments like this tend to invite more commentary, more clarification, and sometimes more confrontation. As political attention slowly builds towards the next electoral cycle, activist narratives will also begin to change. Messages may become more refined, alliances may become more visible, and positions that once seemed fixed may begin to shift under pressure. This is not unusual. In Nigeria's political history, moments of tension often precede periods of realignment. New actors emerge, old alliances weaken, and unexpected partnerships take shape. But these changes rarely happen in isolation. They are influenced by signals, subtle indicators that reveal the direction of power. Government response is one of those signals. Whether authorities choose engagement, silence, or enforcement will shape how these movements evolve. A heavy-handed approach may escalate tensions. A more measured response may open space for negotiation. Media framing is another signal. How stories are told matters. The language used, the emphasis placed, the narratives amplified, all of these influence public perception. Over time, they can redefine how entire movements are understood. And then there is the risk of escalation. When ideological differences become public and personal, they can harden into divisions that are difficult to reverse. What begins as disagreement can evolve into rivalry. And rivalry, if left unchecked, can deepen existing fault lines. In a country as diverse as Nigeria, those fault lines often follow familiar paths: ethnic identity, regional loyalty, historical grievance. Once those lines are activated, the consequences can extend far beyond politics. They can shape how communities relate to each other, how trust is built or broken, how unity is imagined or abandoned. Looking further ahead, the long-term consequences begin to take form. Activism itself may be redefined. What it means to resist, to demand change, to represent the people, these ideas are not fixed. They evolve with each generation, with each political moment, with each new challenge. From this period of tension, new voices may emerge. Individuals who learn from the strengths and weaknesses of existing movements. Figures who attempt to bridge divides, or in some cases, deepen them. These emerging actors will carry forward the lessons of this moment. Lessons about unity, about strategy, about the cost of division,
and about the importance of clarity in a complex political environment. As the narrative returns to where it began, the significance of Sowore's statement becomes clearer. It was never just a personal opinion. It was a signal pointing to deeper ideological differences within Nigeria's activist space. Differences that have existed quietly but are now becoming harder to ignore. And in that signal lies the central challenge. Because the real issue is not who is right or wrong. It is whether Nigeria can sustain a shared vision for justice and reform in the face of internal differences. Whether diverse voices can find common ground without losing their identity. Or whether those differences will continue to grow, gradually weakening the collective strength needed to push for meaningful change. That question remains open, and its answer will shape not just the future of activism, but the future of Nigeria itself. If this analysis helped you understand what's really happening behind the headlines, share this video with someone who needs the full picture. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned to Naija Update 24/7 for more updates.